Have you been taking parenting classes? This cookie's a little too young. All right, so quick little review. These are things you really need to have a good handle on, okay? So this is kind of the 10,000 foot view of what we talked about last week. And you really need to understand this stuff kind of in your daily use. So if you don't, go back and review, okay? Anybody want to tell me what high frequency beaming is? Remember the horns and how the higher the frequency, the narrower the coverage, and it becomes like a laser. I called it the lane of death because it'll cause a lot of pain for people if you have too much of that going on. Now, hopefully they will have tuned the system so that we don't have to deal with that. But it can happen. It can depend on the content, not just the speaker array and stuff, okay? Speaker coverage, that one's pretty obvious, right? You deal with it with your stereos. Polar patterns, right? Right. Yeah, that thing. Balanced versus unbalanced. That's hard to explain without going into a big, long thing, but the main takeaway is unbalanced are better for professional audio, and they're more noise-free, and you can run them hundreds of feet if you need to. That's the main takeaway. Get a good handle on that signal flow business. If you look at the Avantis app that you all downloaded and you look at a channel, that's laid out right in the area of signal, right in the sequence of signal flow. So if you open up the channel by clicking on it, I actually have the app here. So if you open up a channel by clicking on it, oops, come on, there we go. You can see across the top, it's got all the bits that make up the channel, and it's from left to right happens to be the signal flow, okay? So that's a kind of a little handy reference for you. But you need to have a good handle on that, and I haven't checked on this console, but it's probably true. A lot of times you can flip where the certain things live in the signal chain depending on the kind of processing that you like to do. So be aware that that's a possibility as well.
Do you usually like having your parametric EQ before or after compression? Because they kind of work against each other, don't they?
Well, it all depends on what you want. You know what, I can't remember. I think that I put the compression before my EQ when I'm mixing in my studio. Because of, well, we're going to get into compression actually, but that's a real good segue, although we're not ready to segue yet. So,
missed that in the notes.
Okay, anybody remember what noise floor is? You experienced some noise at your
You
last.
just have like random noises, like electrical or Christmas lights making like buzzy noises.
Yeah, that's actually interference. You would call that interference. But the noise floor is, it's just the noise that the equipment inherently makes. You're not putting any signal through it. You just turn up all the faders. You hear hiss. That's all the electronics in the device, okay? And even purely digital devices, well, there's no such thing if you got, because you got analog in and analog out, but even they create noise, okay?
Wasn't the noise floor also impacted by the bit rate?
Yes, as a matter of fact. Well, not bit rate, but word size, okay? The size of the digital representation of one point in the waveform, right? So you can have 8 bits, 12 bits, remember that demonstration? 16 bits, 24 bits. we are 24 bits, 96 kilohertz, okay, which is 2 times 48, and 48 is the frequency that's really nice for broadcast, because broadcast streams happen at 24 frames a second. So they're all even multiples of each other. So they're really easy to convert. So we're running at 96 because that gives us the highest fidelity to do all of our processing before it gets converted down to 48 for video. And then headroom, which we didn't actually talk about. Okay, I forgot about headroom and that it exists. So that's the first thing we're going to go over today.
Of course, kind of backs it.
Of course.
Of course.
Headroom is simply the space between the highest peak of the audio signal that you're dealing with and the maximum level that your system can reproduce without distortion. Okay? Now there are two different things when you're talking about live mixing consoles and recording on a computer. 0 dBFS, remember that term? Decibels full scale. That's the maximum typically that you can do it, right? It happens to be 100% true when you're recording in the computer. You hit that, your signal just goes, and it sounds like that too when it does, okay? But on mixers, and I checked it out on the Avantis, you'll see that, well, let's go over and look at it again. You'll see that oh, that's a little hard to see. But you'll see that it actually has, that's 0, and there's actually space above it. So what they're doing there for you is they're giving you a reference point. Remember, loudness is always in comparison to what, right? So what they're doing is they're giving you a reference level, and they're saying that level right there, you really shouldn't go higher than that. Now if you do, we'll be able to handle it, but you really shouldn't, because you're getting into the danger zone. Okay, it's like running your engine at too high in RPM or something. Okay, if you slam, actually peak it out, I don't know how this console behaves. I know that my mixing software at home, remember I talked about 24 bits as being, it gives you 140 decibels of range. Most modern audio software that you use to record on your computer is actually 32 bits floating point, which means basically you have the ability to represent an infinite amount of levels. So if you overload it, you can kind of do that. It can accumulate badness, but it doesn't actually sound unbelievably horrible right away. Once again, don't recommend it. It's not good practice, but so headroom it's really important to understand it and to respect it. It's especially important when I've whined about this before in this class, when you get the musicians to say, the drummers to say, you know, play your kit for me, give me a sound check, and then I tell them, play like you're really playing, and they, I am. And then as soon as the band starts up, they're 3 to 6 decibels louder every time. So you just compensate for that. When you're setting that first gain, you make sure that it's set lower than you would actually run it. And then when they play, then it's correct. And you can always tweak it a little bit if you've got time to be the level you want once they're rehearsing. But remember that gain, I'm talking about that knob right at the beginning, that first knob, you adjust that knob, it affects everything downstream, including their in-ear monitors. So that's something you want to get together and then not touch after the show starts, or the service starts.
Is that the top on the?
Yes, it
is.
is.
At the very top.
The very top one.
What's
It's
the
usually.
What's the red ones at the bottom?
Oh, on the Avantis?
Yeah.
Is that the one you said was double?
Well, it has an indicator on the bottom. I know that. But the red ones are pan, I think.
Is that pans?
Yeah. I think so.
Okay.
Oh, actually, no, they're multifunction.
So you can program what you want.
What you want them to do. So on the hardware console, just to the right, there are like 3 buttons that change the function of those. So you can say it's pan, it's something else, and you can actually program it. You can have it be.
So essentially, they're a dummy knob until you tell it what
That's
it
right.
is.
That's right.
All
I don't know what the default value is for it, but that's what they are.
I
But
believe
the
it's
top
7.
one is the gain. So if you wanted to adjust the gain, you'd touch it up there, and you'd get access to this thing, and we'll talk about this thing in a minute, later. But so this is how you set the initial gain. This is the value you're interested in. Trim. Go
Can you
ahead.
describe the difference between gain and volume then?
There's a subtle difference, okay? Volume is kind of what you finally hear coming out of the speakers. That's the way I would use the term. Sometimes these terms get interchanged, so that's a really good question. Gain is the amount of amplification that a particular circuit is giving to the signal, okay? It goes in at a value of 1, comes out at a value of 10. Okay, it has a gain of 10 times. Follow me?
Okay.
All right? So everything in this signal chain, once again, everything in this signal chain can affect the gain. We'll talk about compressors and gates today, and EQ today. That's what's on the agenda. But you set the gain here, but then you start processing the signal here, and all of these things can make the gain higher or lower, or you can pass it through without affecting the gain, which actually never happens, but it's theoretically possible. But that's what the gain is, okay? So think of the gain as the volume for the little piece of processing that you're dealing with. When I think of the volume as kind of what's output by the fader down at the bottom here that you're tweaking, right?
Uh-huh.
Think of that as the volume. Does that help, Becca?
A little.
Okay. It can be a little, it is a subtle difference, and that's a really good question. But just think of gain as, like I say, the difference in intensity between the signal going in and the signal going out. So it's going in quiet, it's coming out loud. That, for a particular circuit, right? It's still living in the electronic realm, though. It hasn't moved out to your ears yet. So when I think of volume, I think what my ears are receiving. Okay?
Okay.
Maybe that's an easy way to think of it.
So gain is almost like a multiplier of what's coming.
That's exactly what it is.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, that's what's happening inside the digital mixer, is it's multiplying.
Mhm.
Back when I was designing synthesizers, we were all super thrilled when we got a 32-bit multiplier chip. It was this big, and it had heat fins on it. This is in the 70s, right? Now, every single one of those elements in every single strip has 32-bit multiplication going on, or 24-bit, because that's how powerful computers have gotten. Yeah, that's a crazy thing, but anyway. This computer is much nicer to use. Okay, so now like I say, I forgot my tablet in order to control the volume here, so we're not going to be able to hear any examples. I didn't have too many of them anyway. But what I'm going to want you to do for homework is, once I send the presentation out to you, I want you to go to every link and read every article and listen to every example, okay? Because we're going to get into some kind of bizarre concepts in this episode. There's another kind of distortion you can run into, and it's related to headroom. Because if you turn up the volume 100%, and this is mostly having to do with digital audio workstations, okay? But it can, I don't know how much a live mixer is affected in this way. But when I'm mastering a song, which is the final process, I've got all the songs mixed and everything, and then I'm just doing the final tweaks on it. You want to make it kind of as loud as you can, without distortion. And they always advise you to make it, the peaks be at -1, not at 0, at -1. And I always wondered why. This is why. If you look at, you sample a waveform going in, right? Remember this process? You slice it up and you get a numerical value for these points. Then, inside the machine, this is the way it's represented. Then the machine tries to reproduce it. And look what happens between these 2 points. It goes above the volume level, which sounds horrible. It's fingernails on a chalkboard. There's nothing nice about it. So that's why it's really important to know about headroom and to respect it. There's many reasons, but that's a more subtle one.
So that's a delicate balance between your advice of trying to maximize the gain
Yep.
and then give enough headroom that you're not.
That's exactly right. So if you don't maximize gain, then you're closer to the noise floor, which you don't want to be, right? So it is a balancing act for sure. That's a good point. So now we're going to talk about equalization. This is something that most people sort of know something about because they own stereos and headphones and they might make it brighter or boomier or they make it thump more, right? That's all equalization. But typically on a stereo or something, you used to just have bass and treble, then they had bass and middle and treble, and now they'll have software versions of a graphic equalizer, which we'll talk about what that is in a second. But all it is the ability to adjust the frequency bits of an audio signal, right? That's all it is. But there's a few different ways of doing it. This is what it can do for you. Obviously, sculpt the sound. It can remove boominess, like in the gym. It can remove irritating frequencies. This frequently happens with singers. And it has, although I've never had to do it with you, Katie, but I have had to do it with Christina. I had to do it with everybody. But what can happen is that once you get the whole band cooking and the singers start really hollering, maybe a song or two into the rehearsal, your ears start going, ow. And it's usually something to do with the vocals, I find anyway. And it's usually some frequency is peaking and it's starting to fatigue your ears. Now you can stand to listen to it for a song or two, but a whole service or a whole night, forget it. I mean, people would rather leave. They get tired of the music and they don't know why, and so they leave. And you don't want that to happen. So
We used to have that happen with Jason preaching. We'd have to adjust him.
oh yeah,
I mean, there were certain points where he would elevate his volume,
yeah.
and he would just, you'd hit something, you're like, well, that's not right.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's a combination of two things. One, when the dynamics change, all the circuitry, all the math that's going on in between that microphone and your ears, behaves differently when it's louder than when it's quieter. Your ears behave differently also, which is not something I covered. I should think about throwing that in. But also, you probably had some of that beaming going on.
I'm sure we did, yeah.
High frequency beaming. So if you look at the curve that I have when I'm mixing, when I've got Jason's, now he's gone back to the Countryman,
Yeah.
I'm never going to get that to sound as good as the handheld did, ever. But I can get it pretty close. And 90% of the people aren't going to hear the difference. But you should see the EQ curve that I've got. It looks ridiculous. And next time I'm, mixing, and during the sermon or something, if you get bored of the sermon, come up and I'll show you. I'll show you what the EQ curve looks like. It's crazy.
Do you have to adjust it every week, or is it
No.
pretty much?
No, it's been pretty consistent. That's an excellent question. Typically what I do have to do is I'm always on a quest to make things sound better. So this last week, I was on a quest to make his voice sound more natural, warmer, and I started to get really bad low end feedback, and I had to just back off from it. But I did get it a little warmer. So that's of course one thing that'll affect things, but also it's mostly, I find, volume levels. Once you've tweaked everything so that the mix is good and everything, and then you take a half-hour break and you come back, it can sound totally different to your ears. I mean, supposedly your ears are better than average ears by the time you've done it for a while. But it's like there's no explanation for it. Did the humidity change? I mean, I'm talking about before people come in. It'll just sound different all of a sudden. And it happens all the time, which is why this whole idea of having a preset, because you can save a strip, all the settings in a strip, you can save that and recall it. This is my kick drum setting. It's a starting point.
Right. It's
a start.
It's a template.
Yeah, it's a
Work
template.
from there.
So, and this mixer is unbelievably programmable. You can actually program what used to be the hardware configuration of the thing. So remember I told you about auxiliary buses, right? That's what you guys use in your in-ear monitors, those of you that are musicians. You each have got your own mix bus, right? This thing has 42 buses, and you can set them up to be mix buses, effects buses. You program the buses themselves, which I've never seen in anything but a digital audio workstation. So that's kind of crazy, and we probably won't have you guys be doing that, but it's something you can dig into if you want. It fixes a phenomenon called masking, hence my nice little graphic there. If you got two instruments playing exactly the same notes at exactly the same time, and you want to be able to hear both of them as distinct instruments, many times you have to go for equalization so that this one lives in a little bit higher frequencies and this one lives in a little bit lower frequency range. And they sound nice. Otherwise, one of them might just sit on top of the other one and you can't hear the second thing at all. There's a lot of that goes on in the kind of music we do on Sunday mornings.
Left-hand keyboard bass players are often.
Oh, yeah, right.
Often.
Right. That's why. Well,
What?
well, but these guys actually aren't that bad in that way. There's if I get someone that's like used to really banging in a rock and roll band and making drama happen and doing these big octaves on the bottom, yeah, it's all over the bass. You can fix that with EQ, but I usually fix it by going to the keyboard player and say, stop doing that. But sound people aren't supposed to do that, okay? Generally, sound people are supposed to do that. Of course, you can add highs, you can add lows, and prevent feedback. So sometimes you guys have probably witnessed it, that I'll have some feedback problems. Typically when this will happen, probably the first few times we're in the new room. One instrument or another will have feedback issues. And what I'll do is I'll have everybody plug their ears and I'll make it go into feedback, and then I can see where the feedback is happening. I'll show you how in a minute. And then I can use equalization to turn just that frequency way, way, way down. And now I can get more volume out of whatever it is that I'm trying to mix, okay?
And you'll be able to see that feedback in a graph, more or less?
Da-da-da. Okay, now this is an app that I want you guys to pay for and download, okay? It's $5. It's on your phone. It's really handy to have. It's called RTA Audio, okay? And what it is, you guys have probably all seen a display something like this. It's just a graph of the frequency values of what you're listening to. So, but the nice thing about this is that you can generate feedback, and then one of these things will go way up, and it leaves a trace of the highest level that it has heard since you reset it, okay? And so you can see where that is, and then you can take these guys and move them around right to the peak of where that feedback occurred, and you can say, oh, that was at 1.456 hertz, right? Kilohertz, rather. And then you can go over to your equalizer and notch that out, and now you can get a whole bunch more volume. You used to have to be able to do that just by knowing what the frequencies were, by hearing them, which is insane. But I just started producing a brilliant pianist. And I sat him down at the keyboard, and he starts playing a song. He says, this is wrong. I said, what do you mean it's wrong? He said, it's sharp. And I looked, and the software instrument was tuned 1.5% sharp.
Wow.
He's got perfect pitch, this guy. It's so rare. And I accidentally did it a couple more times, and every time he wouldn't play. It bothered him so much. Bizarre. Bizarre, but cool. Anyway, that's the pointer for the app. Download it, fiddle with it. It's pretty fun. Go around, listen to fans in your house and stuff. It's interesting. Okay. These are all the types of equalizers that are available. This is actually a picture of a parametric equalizer. A parametric equalizer is what you guys will be using. It's in graphic form on the mixer, okay? We'll get into what that is because that's mostly what you'll use. Graphic equalizers, they exist in the mixer, and you will probably use that to fix certain problems. I'll talk about that. Then you've got high cut filters, low cut filters, also called low pass, high pass. We'll get into that. High shelving, low shelving, band pass, notch, and bell, and we'll talk about all of them. Science fiction analogies, okay? These are parametric equalizer controls that are going to be available to you. You can actually, this is something that'll throw you if you're not careful. You get in there and you start tweaking the EQ and you go, nothing's happening, what's going on? There's actually an on-off on the mixer. You got to engage the equalizer. You got to and throw it into the circuit before it'll do anything. The shape, the slope, the frequency, the gain, the Q, and you can turn particular bands of frequencies off and on. So here are the shapes. These are basically just graphical representation of, that's how the parametric equalizer works. It's just a graph of level versus frequency, just like that analyzer thing is, okay? And these are the shapes that they give you in order to sculpt the sound, okay? You can come back and refer to this if you want, but this is all going to become second nature to you. You typically don't use these terms in particular, but this one, and this one, you use. Those terminologies you actually use. And mostly you don't use high cut and low cut, you use low pass and high pass. Those are typically, that's the vocabulary you use, but the other vocabulary exists. Slope. This is an interesting one. And I'll show you some illustrations of these, but the Avantis offers 4 slopes, 3 Butterworth curves, and 1 Bessel curve. Now these are just names for old analog electronic circuits. They're Butterworth filters and they're Bessel filters, okay? Just so you know the history, you don't need to know anything about how they worked other than that the higher the decibel number, the steeper the curve. And the Bessel curve has a gentler slope, okay? So if you want to do something with EQ where you're doing some cutting, but you don't want it to sort of sound so severe, honestly, the difference live mixing is going to be so subtle, you won't be able to pick up on it. but they threw it in there, so. Okay, so the frequency is just which frequency you're trying to affect. In the case of high pass, low pass, it's the corner frequency. It's the place where it starts falling off the cliff. Over here's a low pass. The gain is just how much you pull it up or pull it down, right? And the Q is just the width of the frequencies you're trying to affect, right? Now there's a YouTube video affiliated with this that you need to watch, and he says Q stands for quality factor. I never heard that before. I don't believe him. My electrical engineers just call it Q. But if we go over to if we go over to the mixer here. Oops, here we go. There's your equalizer. And you can just grab points and pull them up and down like that. And on this one, I don't know if you can squeeze it. Yeah, you can. No. Am I squeezing it? No, I'm just moving it up and down. So you would have to select the Q. See what that does? Just becomes obvious when you see it in graphic form.
Does the two-finger scroll work to squeeze it?
No, it didn't. Not here. I mean,
Not a pinch, but a scroll.
oh, a scroll maybe.
No.
Yeah.
Okay.
No.
We'll have touchscreen capabilities on the mixer right now.
Oh, the mixer. There's a well, I was going to show you the. Did I leave some links for that? I don't know if I did, but there's a whole series of videos about the Avantis mixer, but they presume a lot of knowledge and they throw a whole bunch of this vocabulary at you in rapid succession. So I'm not going there right away. Plus the guy, he must be Italian or something because he's like this all the time. Find it a little bit distracting, but it's good, clear stuff. But
But you'll be able to do what you were just doing essentially.
yeah, I think so. Okay, well you can. Yeah. I mean, yes, you can.
Okay.
And it's a lot easier than on this screen because you have more real estate. There's two of them as well. All right. So watch that YouTube video. And that's it for compression. Now EQ, excuse me, that's it for EQ. EQ is really, really important. It is probably the thing you're going to adjust the very most. Okay? So get familiar with it. Go on that app and fiddle around with it. Go into Reaper, import any song you want into a stereo track and fiddle with the EQ. See what it does. Get familiar with how 1K sounds, how 10K sounds, right? How 300 hertz sounds. All right.
How many EQ bands did you say you have?
I think it has, it's got high pass, low pass, and I think it's got 4 bands. Yeah. A band is just how many points you can adjust with it, okay? So compression is a wild and wonderful and mysterious thing, and it's important to learn eventually. Okay, I really don't expect anyone to master it out of the chute, but it's an extremely valuable tool once you master it. Okay, I've been doing sound for 25 years and I haven't mastered it yet.
So not a lot of hope for us.
No, you always find out something new about compression. And people are using it in new and different and fun ways. But basically, it's just taking remember I talked about dynamic level, the difference between the highest volume and the lowest volume. there's a problem with dynamic level, and it started, the history of compression is that when they used to make 78s and LPs, they could not mechanically reproduce the dynamic range that your ears actually hear. So they had to reduce that dynamic range somehow. And on 78s, they did it with mechanically, because none of that was even electronic, okay? But when they got to albums, they have a mastering process where they had these big outboard rack-mounted gears that had tubes in them and everything, and all these knobs and stuff. And they would reduce it by using this this process called compression. And whereas your ears can hear about 120 decibels in difference, on records it was about 40 to 45 decibels. And ever since records have been invented, vinyl has been invented, that is what we're used to hearing. When we hear music, we're used to hearing about 40 decibels of dynamic range, unless you listen to classical music. So you actually end up getting irritated if it gets too quiet, like in your car or whatever. Why is it, or that if the difference between quiet and loud is too big, it's almost irritating, unless you've got a really great set of headphones on. So kind of everything is compressed. I mean, I don't know if you put compression on your bass. I put it on the bass. Yeah. Guitar players compress everything. Keyboards, piano, not really. Typically, although I'll do some mild compression out front. But the other sounds, the pads and all that stuff, those have like this much dynamic range out of this much available, right? Because you hit it hard, hit it soft, there's not a lot of difference. There's some, okay? So your ears are used to it, and the listener is used to it. So they even demand it in live amplified music now. They don't know that they demand it, but if you give them too much dynamic range, they don't like it. They even get startled by it. So that's what compression is for. If you look up audio compression, they will start pointing you at things like MP3s and stuff. That's not what we're talking about. That is data compression. Totally different thing. You can ignore it for this use of this. I'm just telling you that's not what we're talking about. They might call this audio dynamic compression if you're looking up more stuff about it. And I do suggest that you do that as you have the time. As you get comfortable with some of this other stuff, start looking up compression and seeing the different ways people use it. So, obviously, one of the uses is to control the dynamics on vocals and instruments. I always put it on vocals, because that's the most dynamic thing that's coming off the stage. And otherwise, you can think of a compressor as a little engineer that's automatically turning the volume up and down. It's turning down the loudness, the loud bits, turning up the quiet bits for you automatically. If you're struggling, like typically Nathan does songs where he's singing down here and then he'll jump up an octave, and he's got a ton more power up that octave. So he jumps twice or 2.5 times in volume. And I'm having to, right? You can mitigate some of that by putting some compression on it, but you don't want to do too much, or it sounds a bit like a strangled cat. It sounds weird. And you'll learn to hear those differences, and I'm pointing you at some resources that allow you to listen and see if you can hear the differences. So you'll have to do that as your homework.
What do you mean by more sustain on bass?
Well, we'll get to that. So you get better attack on drums, and we'll talk about how that works. So if the drums are kind of sounding, they're there, but they just don't have that snap, you can actually use compressors to get it. You can use it to get better tones on the drums, get better sustain on the bass. So you play your bass, I've got this attack, and then it sustains out like this, right? But I want that bass note to hang longer, a lot longer than what is naturally happening. Your dynamic level, it's still there, but it's fallen below the level of everything else in the band when you're playing a boom, big sustained whole notes, right?
We do that. There's a lot.
Oh, a lot in this kind of music. So I always put pretty strong amount of compression on the bass, and what that does is it makes the loud bits quieter but it also makes the quieter bits louder, and I'll show you how you do that. And then what ends up happening is he plays that note and it just goes boom, and it hangs until he plays the next note. And you don't always want that, but I want it frequently as a sound man. This is why, once again, the sound man is the fifth member of the band. If you don't make the sound man mad at you if you're a band member, because they can really mess up your life. I've got some funny stories about that.
Well, so I mean, I guess to kind of illustrate it more, if I had a compression pedal,
Yep,
but I don't have today, on those songs,
yep.
I could
Hit the pedal.
hit the pedal, let it go, and then maybe at the beginning of the song, there's a lot of that, maybe it gets not needed towards the end, I can
Yep,
okay,
yep. But also, it can affect tone as well.
sure.
Especially in the guitar world, not so much in the bass world. It can be used for a process called de-essing. Anybody guess what that might be? Don't tell us. Right? He knows.
Yes.
The hissing, I don't know, that makes an S sound.
Yeah, well, it's getting rid of the S sounds. It's de-essing. So if you, modern vocals, you listen to a lot of modern pop vocals, they sound like really airy. They got this breathiness to them, right? You know what I'm talking about? Right? Picture it in your head. If I do that, which I do on Sunday mornings because it actually increases intelligibility of the vocals, right? But you do that a lot, they start singing those S's and those T's and those K's, and suddenly it's like a needle in your eardrum because it's turned up so loudly. So what you can do is you can use a compressor to just get rid of that little frequency that S is making. It's like a dynamic equalizer. It only kicks in when they do the S's. You can set up a compressor to do that.
That's cool.
But that's typically a separate piece of equipment called a de-esser, but it's really a specialized compressor, yes.
You'd usually then put that after, from the chain perspective, after the EQ, right?
Yeah, yeah. Oh, absolutely. It's a repair device, right? So after you've done everything else, then you repair the things you broke on the way, so to speak. And then another way that I use it on Sunday morning, but I don't like to do too much of it because it can make the band sound really dull, is I put a little bit of compression on the overall mix to keep me from blowing out people's ears and the band from doing it accidentally. But only a little bit, and I try to make sure that I'm not really hitting it very much. It's just like an emergency stopgap measure, right? Some people are really radical about it, and they put a thing called a limiter on the output, and we'll get to what a limiter is in a minute. That's even more radical.
And you can control compression on and off at will?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. So yes, there's a lot of controls for a compressor, right? Threshold, ratio, attack, release, knee, makeup gain, blend, side chain, look ahead, and other compressors have other knobs, and some of them name them different parameters. I discovered that there are certain kinds of compressors which have a hysteresis control, which is not something you've ever heard of, but it's an engineering term. I'll show you. We actually have an equivalent to that on the Avantis, and it's really nice. Actually, not a compressor, but a gate. When we'll explain what that is in a minute. Okay. Anyway, here we go. 2 pages on the controls. The threshold is the level of the input signal at which the compressor turns on and starts compressing. Right? So it gets to this level, I'm going to start doing what I do. Okay? The ratio is how much compression to apply to the signal. Now, the ratio, that terminology is used because the way that a compressor functions is for instance, one of the settings might be for every 2 decibels of input gain, I only want it to go up 1 decibel on the output. Okay? or every 4 decibels, I only want it to go up 1 decibel. It's a ratio, all right? We'll talk about that more in a minute. Attack is an interesting one. This is a little bit more. So threshold and ratio, you're going to be, those will be the first things you start playing with, okay? The attack time is a more advanced setting. The rest of these are more advanced. Although you're going to be, makeup gain is also something you'll be playing with typically. So the attack determines how quickly the compressor reacts once you cross the threshold. So my signal comes in, I cross the threshold, I don't turn on right away. I wait for a second, determined by the attack, then I turn on. Okay, and you'll see why that's really useful in some cases in just a minute. The decay determines how long it takes for it to turn off once it drops below the threshold. You can set these things to like 0, but that sounds really weird. It sounds like someone took a scissors to the beginning and the end of the notes. You don't ever want them typically to be at 0. But we're talking about values that are measured in milliseconds, thousandth of a second. Okay. The ear starts perceiving strangeness at about 10 to 20 milliseconds. I mean, you can hear the difference between on the attack on a compressor between 0 and 5 milliseconds. You can hear the difference, but if you're just a casual listener listening to something, I did some empirical experiments because when I was designing synthesizers, because I wanted to know how much delay between me hitting the keys and a sound coming out of the speakers that I could stand before it felt mushy, and it was about 20 milliseconds. For me, other people say they can tell like it's 15, but 20 was my value. Okay, and then the makeup gain just controls the output volume. Remember I told you, every one of these elements affects gain. So you actually have a control to do it on this guy. The knee determines how the compressor turns the corner when crossing the threshold. So, and we'll have a graph of this in a second, but the signal goes up, hits the threshold, and then starts compressing. That's called a hard knee. If it just kind of goes oh, at that point, that's a soft knee. I can never hear the difference, but some guys claim they can. And we have the ability to change it. The blend, I can't remember if the Avantis has this. You can actually, on more advanced compressors, and you can also patch a mixer to do this, but on more advanced compressors, you can actually, once you got compression going, you can actually blend back in some of the original signal, if you want. So what you can do, what that's for is like you use the compressor to maybe fatten up a drum, but you got the drum sound really fat, but it has no, it just sounds, right? So you blend in some of the original to get some of that snap back, but now it's fatter with the snap. That would be one use of it. It's a real musical thing that you have to determine whether you want to do it or not. Sidechain is a bizarre thing. Normally the way a compressor works is it looks at what's coming in and it engages by analyzing the signal that's coming in. So I'm singing into my compressor, it looks at the voice, and if it gets too loud, it compresses, right? What if I was able to, what if the drummer's playing at the same time, and I used the drum, the kick drum, to do the compressor, but I'm singing into the compressor. Now my voice is going like that with the kick drum. And if you listen to some electronic dance music, they do that on purpose. They'll usually keep the voice the same, but they'll have the whole mix pumping like that, which is something you used to avoid like the plague because it meant you were doing something wrong. Now it's fashionable, okay? And the reason for that is even when you got it turned down, it sounds like it's really loud, like you're overloading the speakers. And they do it on purpose so that it sounds loud even if you're listening to it quietly. It's a psychological thing. So we won't be using sidechain live, typically, but there are some other uses for it that I want to tell you about. And in digital compressors, there is a function called look ahead. This won't be available to us live. But what it essentially does is, remember, it's trying to react to the input signal. But it's a process of reacting. So even if you have the attack set to 0, it takes the circuitry some amount of time to figure out what's going on and then do something about it. Look ahead means it can see, 10 milliseconds into the future. Oh, it's going to get really loud. I'm going to make it get really quiet right when that hits. Okay, you can do that in digital audio workstations, and it can make the compressing more transparent.
Could you, in theory, do it live if the entire system is then delayed by that same amount
Yes,
of time?
you could. Here we go. Here's a graphical representation. Hopefully this will clarify anything that may have been mysterious. So here's the threshold level. I typically draw the threshold in this dimension. But, so I have the input here and the output here, but, so the threshold's here. So until you hit the threshold, whatever comes in is the same as what goes out. But once you hit the threshold, it starts making it be quieter at the output if you do the graphing, right? And if you have the ratio be set to infinite, you're doing something called limiting, meaning nothing can get past that level. You're not allowing anything to get past that level. Now, sometimes back in the day of analog systems, people would put limiters at the output, especially if they were renting you a PA system and they didn't want you to blow their speakers. They put a limiter at the output and not let you touch it. And it sounds terrible if you hit it, usually. It did back in the day. Anyway. So, here's a useful use of attack time. Let's say I want to compress the drums and make them ring a little more or have a little bit more beef. Or I've got a drummer that's just way out of control, which a lot of them are. And but you really like the snap, which is what the drumming is all about, right? You just move the attack out a little bit. We're talking 20 to 30 milliseconds. You're going to preserve these transients, but then you're going to start compressing after that period of time. So these don't get touched, and then the rest of it gets compressed. And then after the threshold, it starts slowly letting go, depending on the release time. That you will be doing on Sunday morning. On the drums, if you decide you need some compression to get them to be consistent, because some drummers, they can get weak when they go way over to the floor or something like that, or they're very dynamic on the snare, which is a real plus, but sometimes it doesn't work live, so you gotta make those loud things quieter so that you can hear the quiet things, right? I always give the snare and the kick drum about a 30 millisecond attack time so that those transients make it through. So here you can see the actual effect of attack and release times in a different graphical representation, if this helps, okay? So this is the compressor. It's not doing anything, then it turns on, then it turns off. And this is how it affects the signal. It chops off that blue bit. So you can see as soon as this guy exceeds the threshold, the compressor turns on and starts turning these things down, And then as soon as it drops below the threshold, the compressor turns off, and these aren't affected, if that's helpful, right? And here's a compressor that's got the knee thing going on, same kind of deal. It's got a slow attack and a slow release. So it's letting these ones through, even though they exceeded the threshold, right? It's letting the first ones through, and then it's engaging after the attack time passes. And then once it drops below the threshold, it slowly releases. So it's still compressing down there, even though it's below the threshold. And these all just have different effects on the tonality of the
Is it
No.
usually a linear release like that?
That's an excellent question. I don't think it is. I think it's exponential. But I think there are some compressors you can select what that is. There's the knee. So you can see, here's the threshold right here. Now they didn't, I'm just like Jason. This is great. They didn't draw a line for us. But once again, once you hit the threshold, it starts compressing. Here's with a soft knee. Now notice that it actually starts compressing before it hits the threshold.
How does it know that?
Well, because the signal,
There's an approach.
yeah, it senses that the signal is at this point, and so it says, I'm going to kick my knee in right now. That sounded violent. And start doing the compression.
I feel like when my wife knees me when I'm starting to go off the rails at a dinner party.
Yeah, something like
It's kind
that.
of like that.
Yeah.
Things that
And
Soft, well, that's when you want a soft knee.
you want a soft knee,
Yeah.
right?
But often like that knee kicks in a little too early, right?
Yes, yeah, well, yeah. I'm not quite at my threshold yet, so I need to.
And this is also an illustration of makeup gain. So, well, it's not a good example, but basically what makeup gain does is it takes this whole curve and it moves the whole thing up. So in the end, you're not just, if you turn up the makeup gain like that, you're not just turning down the loud parts, you're turning up the quiet parts. And that can be cool, but it also can get you into trouble. And this took me about 2 years of grief to figure this one out, but, we're gonna back up here. If you think about it, compressors, I always used to think compressors just are making the loud parts quiet. But sometimes I get into a situation where I'd have some extreme EQ and some extreme compression going on in a live situation. And the singer would be singing and everything, and they'd stop singing, and I get feedback when they stop singing. As soon as they start singing, no feedback anymore. It's because when they stop singing, the compressor lets everything go again. And the volume comes up, and feedback starts. Okay? That's a case where you've got a really hard compression, and it really is just making the loud bits quiet. But now when the compressor goes off, then it just gets out of the circuit, and things get loud again when it's idling like that. That drove me crazy for the longest time until I figured that out. Anyway,
So in theory, you could move the threshold close to zero,
oh yes, you could, and it would be a nightmare.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
and then is that also sort of a situation where people overuse gates to account for the?
Yeah, we'll talk about gates in a minute, yeah. Yes. So here's a graphical example of side chaining. I kind of explained it to you, but imagine if this is the volume level and you had your voice going through here, or a keyboard pad going through here. Suddenly the keyboard pad itself would have a beat to it, even though it doesn't have that programmed into the sound. You're side chaining the compressor with the kick drum. Right? That's the kick drum on top. That is the amount of gain reduction that the kick drum is telling it to apply to the compressor, and this is the result coming up. It's weird, but they use it all the time to get all sorts of effects, mostly in recorded music. But you'd actually people do use it live. We won't.
Have you ever used sidechaining for just within drums? Whether it's like
No, I don't.
sidechain EQ based off of kick, or the overheads based off of kick?
No. I don't. That'd be interesting though. But I typically don't use sidechaining. Yes, so here, this resource is really nice. It's actually goes beyond just compressors. It's got modules on EQ and stuff. You've seen some of the videos already. I played some of them for you. But it's a really nice course. So I would, once again, look at these guys. There are articles, and some of them have embedded video in them, all right? This is what limiters do, right? You shall go no further. We probably won't use limiters because they really make things sound bad if you have to use them. So if you're good at mixing, you don't have to use them. That's my thought, okay? Remember, a lot of this is my opinion. It's not fact. You'll have to figure out what's what. You sort it out later. So that's what a limiter does. Just here and no further. Oops. All right, gates. They're also called noise gates, and they're generally used as a emergency repair device. But basically, it's kind of the opposite of a compressor. When it gets below a threshold, it turns things down even more. So you can think of it, they also call gates, when they're adjusted a little differently, they call them expanders. They actually expand the dynamic range. That's a real drastic use of them. I've had to use it once or twice to rescue a live performance that I had to mix down that was just horrible. And it's very difficult to do. Gates, remember I talked about self noise? You ever hear a guitar player hit a pedal and all of a sudden their guitar goes because they got distortion and all sorts
Everything's
of...
on there.
Yeah, they just got everything turned up because it sounds great when they hit a chord, but in between it goes right? That happens on Sunday morning. And I really don't like to tell musicians generally how to, like, I want them to be happy. Like, if it thrills them to have that killer tone, even though it's got a horrible noise in between, I try to fix the noise out where I live so that they're thrilled because they'll do a better job, right? Generally, that's what I do. There are exceptions to that. If their basic guitar tone just sounds terrible, I might go up there and say, hey, would you mind adding a little mid-range to that? Where are you at? You know, and a lot of times, hopefully, you know, we all have good relationships with each other, but there's going to be new people coming in, and you got to tread carefully. But remember that the band is your customer, so to speak, and the way that I appeal to them, I've told you this before, is I'll say, boy, you're playing some really good guitar parts, but I cannot get you to stand out in the mix with the tone you've got. How about if you threw in a little of this or that, or a little more high end? Then I could really get you out front. And they go, oh yeah, I want to be out front, you know. But you know, it might sound crass, but it's true. That's actually what I'm trying to do: get them to sound better out front. It happens to be true. So, noise gates fix problems like hiss in guitar, but another thing that they can fix. Whoops, let me go back. Another thing that they can fix is, have you ever heard, and we're going to have some of this now, because we're going to have real drums, when someone whacks a drum and they're maybe not tuned well, or there's a resonant frequency, remember resonant frequencies? In the room, they might whack a tom, and when they've got it through the system, the tom goes, boom, like that. Not doom. That is called ringing. And if you can't get the drummer to tune the drums so that it doesn't ring, or to dampen them, they have various ways of doing it, you might have to use a gate to control that ringing. What you would do is you would adjust it so that as the drum sound is fading out, the gate will kick in once it gets below a particular threshold, and just turn it off so that it doesn't ring anymore. So understand that typically a gate is used to fix problems. I generally hate to use them. I generally like to fix the problem at the source, because gates can cause some serious problems if they're misused.
Could you actually gate, like, on a guitar, like if there was a lot of like fret noise and that kind of stuff? I mean,
No, fret noise.
that's
No, you wouldn't use a gate for that.
get a better guitar player. Probably.
Yeah, a better guitar player would help. No, fret noise is part of
It is
the
what it is, yeah.
part of the deal, you know. But that doesn't bother me too much. But things like what Becca was experiencing the other night, where there was a bunch of electrical noise, a bunch of interference. Was it through the whole PA? Yeah, they found it was some lights, which is typical. But you might have this happens with keyboards a lot, because keyboards are typically put through a direct box and then into the system, and sometimes the keyboards will be plugged into a different electrical circuit than the mixer. That means that, no, this is electronics, I'm sorry, but there's this thing called ground, which is the actual ground, actually. Electricity can flow right into the ground. But if the ground level on circuit A is at a different level than the ground level on circuit B, current will flow through the ground. I told you about our snake problem with the concrete. That's what was going on. So, in most direct boxes will have a switch on the side called a ground lift. That usually gets rid of it. But sometimes it doesn't get rid of all of it. So and if it's really irritating, you might use a gate to get rid of the rest of it. But it's really hazardous to use gates on keyboards, because they'll have these long reverbs on them. They'll just get cut off because it goes below the threshold, and it'll chatter too. And I'll explain that in a minute. Anyway, gates have similar controls as compressors. They're actually very similar. And there's an illustration of what a gate does using a sine wave. So the sound gets below that threshold, it actually turns it right off. And it turns it back on when it gets above the threshold. So it expands the dynamic range. Okay. I told you about hysteresis. You can forget that word, although, once again, it might make a nice cocktail party thing. But we've got a control called hold on the Avantis. And hold does a similar thing to this. But here's the problem that Brian was just talking about. So you've got a gate on, and it's set pretty high, because whatever your gating has a really bad noise thing going on, and it's really distracting. All right? What happens is, this will happen typically like when a note's fading out, say, it'll go below the threshold and then above and then below and then above, and so it'll go kick, 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 kick. The sound will actually cut on and off like that. And I used to have to gate the preacher at a church I was at, because the noise thing was so bad. And it would cut off the beginnings of his words and the ends of his words. And hilarity ensued. So, hysteresis, or in our world we're calling it hold, it basically says, you know what, wait a few seconds before you decide to shut off. Let's see what's going on here. Okay? And as a result, it won't shut off until you're truly below the threshold, and then like that. So it's basically, the way they've got it labeled here is a good way to think about it. It's an open threshold and a closed threshold. All right? Nice way to think about it. We don't have controls called open threshold and closed threshold. We've got threshold and hold. That's it. That's the actual Avantis gate. So there's the attack time, the hold time, the release time, the threshold. And we got this thing called depth, which is a new one on me, because I don't use gates very much, but it's this control right here. So basically, as soon as you hit this threshold, it drops the volume, but it only drops it down to here. And then the response becomes linear again. Whatever. We've also got a side chain, and I'm going to explain something more about side chains. And we may actually use them in this way, not on gates, but, well, maybe on gates. But you can actually, when you're using, this is self-keyed means you're using the input signal, like you normally do, to trigger the compressor. So I'm compressing the vocals. That means I'm looking at the vocal signal to see whether to turn on and turn off and all that stuff, right? It's called self-keyed. What I can do with the Avantis compressors and gates is I can actually do a quote-unquote side chain where I say only look at certain frequencies in the input and only turn on when I see those frequencies, like a de-esser does, right? De-esser only looks at the tss bits, right? Well, why couldn't I set it so that this tom that sounds really boomy when he hits it hard, but it sounds normal when he doesn't, why couldn't I set it up so that when that boomy frequency comes through, I compress just that frequency? This has the capability of doing that. And so does the mixer we've got current. Or does it? I know mine, this one does.
Well, then I would think the other one.
Yeah, the other one probably does too, because they're the same company, so. Anyway, another use of it. And the other night, or May 15th, this gig at the band shell, this magnificent PA, magnificent lighting, 100 people there. Magnificent band.
Yeah.
The rain was so bad. Anyway, the sound guy there knew that his PA had this problematic frequency. And when the music got loud, that frequency would do the laser beam thing. And he knew it from using his PA for however long he's had it, right? So he set up a compressor on the main output, and he set it up to look just at that frequency. So when it hit that frequency, it would turn it down for a second. And it smoothed everything right out. I thought, there's one clever guy. So it was
So
great.
we could essentially find that in our new room,
Yeah.
we might have something like that
Yep.
where we have to,
Yeah.
I mean, we have other ways of playing with it, but
Yeah, I mean,
never know.
so you can think of it kind of, this use of it as kind of like a dynamic equalizer. I'm only equalizing when I need it,
Hmm.
right? And it's automatic. So it's pretty cool. So here we are, control noise, control rain, control bleed. Okay, I do not like this use of gates. Once again, I don't like gates. But if you remember 80s music, just go listen to some 80s music, okay? The drums, and then go listen to some like indie college rock now, and listen to the drums and how different they sound. In the 80s and the 70s, it was like the Nirvana to be able to completely isolate each drum. So it was like its own instrument. And they would use gates to do that. So that if I'm playing the rack tom, if I'm listening on the rack tom and I hit the floor tom, I do not hear the floor tom in the rack tom. That's called bleed when you hear it, right? A good drummer and a good sound guy will be able to use bleed in their favor. And as a matter of fact, our dumb little electronic drums actually fake bleed. I can watch the VU meters, the volume meters, I can watch those bounce up and down, right? When he hits the floor tom on the electronic kit, which is a switch that turns on a waveform to play back completely independently. It could be utterly isolated if we wanted to. He hits that floor tom, I can see the rack tom go up. They do it on purpose because it sounds more natural, right?
You
So
do that with the snare buzz too.
yeah, yeah, but it's not natural enough. But you know, it's a good try. You can also use gates to control feedback. Not the best way to do it, but frequently when you've got a speaker, Jason's not too much of a wanderer, but the 2 churches ago, we had a preacher who literally was like this. I mean, at this rate, too, the whole sermon, and except twice the distance, and we had speaker stacks that he'd walk in front of. Okay, and so it was just a nightmare, and I had to gate his preaching, although he hardly ever stopped preaching, but I had to gate it so that if he wasn't talking and he walked in front of the speakers, I wouldn't get feedback. Okay. And then this is something that you use in recorded music typically. You can do it live. But what if you had the bass guitar on a gate and you were triggering the gate with the kick drum? Because good bass players usually sync up with the kick drum if you listen to music, right? These days. Not always, and doesn't mean you're not good when you do melodic stuff, okay? But there's certain kinds of music, or most pop music, where the bass and the kick are just lockstep. This is a way to do that sort of cheating, to just force them to be lockstep, okay? Of course, now if the bass player's late on a note and the gate turns on, there's nothing there, well, oh well.
You also see it where you duck down the bass on a kick attack and then bring it back in so you hear more of the punch, or where the frequencies are competing.
Yeah, you can use, yeah, I would probably use side chaining of a compressor more for that kind of a thing. There's a use of a compressor called ducking, which is a side chaining thing. But what people will sometimes do is they will, especially if they're trying to just automate the mix, they don't have a sound person, they will have the whole band on a bus. You guys remember what a bus is? They'll have a whole band on a stereo bus. They'll have a stereo compressor on the output, and they'll have that stereo compressor side chained to the vocals. So that when someone sings, the whole band gets turned down a little bit. And then they stop singing, the whole band gets turned up again. That's called ducking. And it's used a lot. We won't be using it because you guys are all going to become superbly qualified sound people. So, I actually did it in 90 minutes this time.
Yes. Well done.
All right, that's because I didn't show any videos or anything. I was robbed of one of my tools. So, listen, please go and check out all the links, read the articles beginning to end, watch the videos, do it at your leisure, and we'll see you next week.
Awesome.
Cool.
Thank you for your attention. Did you learn some things? Good,
Yeah.
good.
I know what Brian's talking about when he says gate.
Yeah.
You gonna get a
We used to
impression cut?
I'm thinking about it actually.
I
Now that I know what it is.
I almost like the overused compression of